Now, this is obviously going to be something different on my channel because I don't usually do these types of things. But as I become more adept at making videos, then I thought it fitting to compare one of the biggest reboots in recent years, or at least in terms of its popularity, and in terms of its strict polarization of the fan base. I am, of course, talking about the Spider-Man movies. Now, putting nostalgia aside, there isn't really a whole lot to discuss when talking about the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. They're they are very well-made movies. I mean, yeah, they can be silly at times, but Raimi's trademark kinetic energy that he uses in his style of filmmaking does suit the Spider-Man character. There is a definite high energy and a lot of fun to be had in Raimi's Spider-Man movies. Whereas the Mark Webb directed 2012 and 2014 Spider-Man movies are aiming for a more realistic route. They try to go for the Batman Begins because they are following the golden rule that every single superhero nowadays has to be a brooding character, brooding darker character. So, what better place is there to start than with the lead character, Spider-Man himself, played in the originals by Tobey Maguire and in the remakes by Andrew Garfield. Now, Maguire's take is definitely more in line with the original 1960s comics, whereas Andrew Garfield is a more updated version of the character. Now, while I do like Andrew Garfield's performance overall, I have to give this one to Maguire. And no, I do not care if that nets me a lot of naysayers because let's not forget, this is an opinion-based video. I am strictly giving my opinion on which movie I think is better. Now, the reason I chose Maguire is because he never really lets you forget what a geek Peter Parker is. Whereas Andrew Garfield, he plays it more like this quirky, awkward kid. I never really felt like he was any kind of outcast. I never really felt like this guy couldn't fit in with basically any crowd that was presented to him. He's just too appealing to his peers to really be believable in the role of Peter Parker, at least in the classic sense. Whereas Maguire, he plays the likable, vulnerable dweeb. He plays the type of Peter Parker, again, like the original comic books. You could argue that The Amazing Spider-Man might be more to your taste if you really got into the updated image, but in my opinion, Maguire was a lot more personable. He was a lot easier to relate to because he was more stoic than Garfield. He, a lot of the times, I don't want to say he seemed like a blank slate, but Garfield was, like I said, quirkier, and the fact that Maguire is so stoic and the fact that he does keep to himself, I think makes him more charming and actually more realistic. I mean, Andrew Garfield, he does put more energy into his performance than Maguire does, but really, how many social outcasts like this do you know? When I think of a social outcast or an awkward person or a nerdy person, or at least in a non-offensive way that I'm guessing the Peter Parker character is supposed to be, then I think of Maguire's performance. He keeps his emotions to himself a lot of the time, or at least in public. Whereas Andrew Garfield, he just talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. So when I say that I like Tobey Maguire more, I just find him more charming from the perspective of someone who knows what it's like to not really feel like you fit in. And in my opinion, Tobey Maguire captures that more. I think Andrew Garfield, a lot of the time, is just way too cool. I mean, for extreme lack of a better term, I think that Andrew Garfield is just too cool to be Peter Parker a lot of the time. So yeah, I like Maguire more. I felt more sorry for him, and a lot of the time, a lot of the time I really liked his silent deliveries. I mean, he could get across so much with so little dialogue a lot of the time. Whereas again, Andrew Garfield just talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and talks.
Wow, great reflex.
Again, different versions, but in my opinion, Maguire is superior because it just goes back to that golden rule of less is more. He was more subtle, and for me, that nets him the top spot in the role of Peter Parker. So how are they as Spider-Man? Well, again, Andrew Garfield just keeps on talking, and you could argue that that is more in line with the character, but here's the thing. The way that they are portrayed is Andrew Garfield is definitely a lot more immature than Tobey Maguire's character. He's meant to be a younger version. But the detriment to that is, at times, his quips can get a little annoying.
You know, if you're gonna steal cars, don't dress like a car thief. You found my weakness. It's small knives.
They go too far with his quips a lot of the time, especially in the second one, where he is quipping when people are dying, such as that opening fight with Rhino. You know what I'm talking about, people who have seen Amazing Spider-Man 2. Andrew Garfield seems to put joking first and doing the job second. Whereas Maguire, yeah, he would say something smart, but when there's someone in danger, he immediately shuts up and goes to save whoever is in danger. Now, you could argue that, well, that's not really in line with the Spider-Man character. Spider-Man is a joker. Well, in my opinion, if we're going strictly by a movie perspective and strictly by what makes sense for such a nice character as Peter Parker, I think one would not naturally make quips when someone's life is in immediate danger. They would wait until afterwards. And again, I think Maguire captures that much more. So how are the love interests? Well, in the original trilogy, we have Mary Jane Watson, played by Kirsten Dunst, and in the newer versions, we have the character of Gwen Stacy, played by Emma Stone. And I will admit, this is an area where I have to say that the new ones generally do it better. Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane, there's not really anything wrong with her performance, but they just gave her nothing to work with. They might have been going for kind of a larger-than-life romance where yeah, she's falling in love with a superhero and she doesn't really know how to react. But the more personal relationship that Gwen Stacy has with Spider-Man in the newer ones, seeing as she knows that he's Peter Parker, that actually gives her a lot more material because she's not just interacting with someone who she supposedly does not know at all. I mean, Kirsten Dunst a lot of the time is acting with Spider-Man. She doesn't know anything about Spider-Man, so naturally she doesn't really have much in the way of dramatic material to work with. Why do you think in so many comic book movies the things get more interesting in terms of the romance when the hero's identity is revealed to the person that he loves? And again, not really anything wrong with Kirsten Dunst's performance. She tries to make this an interesting character, but for the most part, Mary Jane just functions as the damsel in distress. She doesn't really do anything productive in the story, and she really only becomes an active part in Peter Parker's life in the third movie. And at that point, it had become so jarring that a lot of the time you just felt like she was whining, she was complaining, which she was. So there wasn't really anything to convince us that, yes, Peter Parker would be drawn to this woman. Whereas Gwen Stacy, she is smart, she is intelligent, she is perhaps more intelligent than Peter Parker himself. She has a very plucky personality. She actively participates in helping Spider-Man and Peter Parker sort out their issues. And also, she helps stop supervillains. She takes a very active part in the story. She's not just someone to be saved. And that's where I think feminists can really enjoy the newer Spider-Man movies more than the old ones, because in the old ones, Mary Jane was just kind of there to be rescued. She was there to be the girl next door, the beautiful damsel that Spider-Man has to rescue. Again, nothing against Kirsten Dunst, but Emma Stone just plays a more interesting character. And in my opinion, although both couples have chemistry. I think the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone is a lot stronger than the chemistry between Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst. Again, there's chemistry in both scenarios, but again, it just sizzles a lot more with Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone.
This is the maintenance closet. This is the most cliched hiding place you could have chosen. This is the stupidest hiding place.
Take us to the Bahamas of
Listen,
hiding places.
Listen.
You just kissed me.
All right. How'd you like it?
And that, coupled with the fact that Emma Stone very, very much plays an active role, and a more interesting role at that, she becomes an actual three-dimensional, flawed character. It just makes the character of Gwen Stacy far more appealing than the character of Mary Jane Watson, at least in the movies. Well, no hero is complete without his villain, and I'm just going to say it right now. One of the major flaws that I have found in both Amazing Spider-Man movies is the villains suck.
I just wanted everyone to see me.
They suck. They absolutely... They are so boring. All of them. And one thing that you have to give credit to Sam Raimi for is he really knew how to approach these villains with the same amount of energy that he approached the character of Spider-Man with. Again, you could argue that the villains were pretty goofy, especially the character of the Green Goblin, but again, that's keeping in line with the comics. And the fact that they gave the villains in the original Spider-Man movies a split personality, it seemed much more like a much more interesting idea back then, because keep in mind, these movies are 10 to 12 years old at this point. Whereas if you just do a split personality for the Lizard in the first Amazing Spider-Man, you get this feeling of, oh, this has been done before. Now, granted, that's not entirely their fault, considering it can potentially still be an interesting story arc. But the fact that they devote less time to the Lizard than they did to the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus, coupled with the fact that this has been done many times before and better, really makes the Lizard seem like kind of a stock villain. It seems like the kind of villain that we have seen many times before. And the lackluster CGI, once he actually becomes the Lizard, doesn't help either. So the Lizard, no one is really going to be talking about him for a while after this. Dr. Kirk Connors can be interesting, and he was interesting, played by Rhys Ifans, until he became the Lizard. When that happened, he just became discount Green Goblin, in my opinion. He just became just another split personality character, and we have seen those done better in the original Spider-Man movies, so was not a fan of the Lizard. And in terms of the other villains, such as Electro really contrasts with the more serious tone that they are going for, because he is straight out of a cartoon. In fact, no, I've seen cartoons that are more realistic than Electro, and I'm not talking about the fact that I'm not talking about his powers. I'm not talking about the fact that he is basically a walking jolt of electricity. No, I'm talking about how stereotypically geeky that they make him. He's not even a character toward the beginning. The character of Max Dillon, played by Jamie Foxx, is not even a character. He is not a character. He is a caricature. He was some two-dimensional character that we are supposed to feel sorry for, whereas in reality, when I was sitting in the theater, I was just staring at this guy going, really? This is the villain that you were going with in this supposedly more serious, more grounded take on the Spider-Man mythos. It just clashed with everything else that they had strived to set up. And that, coupled with the fact that he basically turns on Spider-Man at the drop of a hat. He turns on Spider-Man because he doesn't feel like he got noticed. That is so weak, and so, yeah, weak. It's just weak. It is generic, and it's not really a motivation that we can get behind, especially since he wants to be noticed in New York City. Another letdown in terms of the villains the second time around was the character of the Green Goblin. Again, something that was done much better by Willem Dafoe in the original Spider-Man movies in terms of performance and in terms of how they wrote him in the movie. When Harry Osborn kind of suffers the same way that the Lizard does, in that once we actually introduce him as Harry Osborn, then he's a fairly interesting character. We can get behind him just fine. Some would argue, not entirely unfounded, that he's more interesting than James Franco. But in having him become the Green Goblin in one movie, and in the last 10 minutes of said movie, it just robs you of A, any interest that you might have had for Harry Osborn, and B, any menace that you might have been trying to build up with the Green Goblin. Again, give the Raimi films credit. They took their time with the Harry Osborn version of the Green Goblin. Whereas Norman Osborn, he was a much stronger actor, so he could get across much more how much of a changed man that Norman Osborn was after he was the Green Goblin. Willem Dafoe really is that good of an actor, that good of a character actor, that he can portray these two personalities with relative ease. Whereas James Franco, the younger of the two Osborns in the original movies, they rightfully chose to keep him as Harry Osborn for 2 movies before introducing him as the new Goblin in Spider-Man 3. Now, Spider-Man 3, whether you like it or not, when the new Goblin showed up, it felt earned. They had earned the right to put Harry in that suit. Whereas Harry in the new Spider-Man movies is just in the suit because people want to see him as the Green Goblin. Not because they earned it. They did not earn it in the new one. They put him in the suit because his last name is Osborn. And people automatically assume, or at least the writers of this movie must have thought that people automatically assume that if your last name is Osborn, you have to get in the Green Goblin suit, whether it makes sense or not. And that goes back to the fundamental problem with these movies, is that they are so preoccupied with setting things up for a potentially larger universe of Spider-Man movies. And again, this goes back to the bottom line decision making that I've brought up so much in these videos, where Sony, who I believe owns the rights to Spider-Man, really wants to compete with other companies out there in terms of their comic book movies, because Marvel has made several movies now that take place in the same universe, but the difference is Marvel actually takes their time. Marvel actually takes their time to develop these characters and these villains one at a time, whereas the characters in the Amazing Spider-Man movies and the plot lines in the Amazing Spider-Man movies feel out of place. And so yeah, not really a whole lot of people are going to be talking about the Green Goblin, or at least as he was portrayed by Dane DeHaan in the Amazing Spider-Man 2. People are not going to remember him so much as they remembered the villains in the original movie. And the Rhino, need I say more? The difference being that the villains in the original Spider-Man movies, whether or not they were corny, were memorable. You remembered all of the scenes with them. That you remembered their backstories. You remembered their motivations. You remembered the performances behind them. The likes of Willem Dafoe, Alfred Molina, Thomas Hayden Church as the Sandman, James Franco as the New Goblin, and even Topher Grace. Even Topher Grace was memorable as Eddie Brock. Whereas in the new one, they seem so preoccupied with other things that they seem to lose time developing the villains. In the first movie, they were preoccupied with setting up A, another Spider-Man origin story, and B, this corporate espionage plot regarding Peter Parker's parents and the company of Oscorp. Whereas in the Amazing Spider-Man 2, they just threw everything into a blender, so that these 3 villains, Electro, Green Goblin, and the Rhino, didn't really get as much time to develop as they probably deserved. Well, if there's anything you would think the new Spider-Man movie would be able to outdo, it would be the action scenes and the effects. So how are those? Well, again, this is not as easy of a choice as you might think, because obviously the CGI has gotten better since Spider-Man 1, because Spider-Man 1 at this point is 12 years old. However, the difference being in the original Spider-Man movies, they really knew how to utilize a lot more practical effects than it seems like the new ones care to do. The new ones are going with all of these flashier villains like the Lizard and Electro and the Rhino. Whereas in the older Spider-Man movies, there was actually a suit. There was a physical battle suit that the Green Goblin had. There were physical arms a lot of the time that went with Dr. Octopus. I mean, obviously not all the time, because they have to move faster than any practical effects could possibly allow. However, just little touches like an animatronic arm pulling off Dr. Octopus's hat really goes a long way in selling the fact that these things are there. They are concrete. They are not being faked in the computer. Really, the only time where the CGI took precedence over practical effects was in Spider-Man 3, but I don't really know how much I can count Spider-Man 3, given the fact that there have only been 2 Amazing Spider-Man movies and 3 Raimi movies. But yeah, obviously the CGI has gotten better in the Amazing Spider-Man and in the Amazing Spider-Man 2. The CGI has gotten smoother, and the way that the action scenes are filmed, there is a greater energy than even Sam Raimi could do. However, even though the CGI can make for some exhilarating action scenes, there comes a point where, in my opinion anyway, you are just too close to the action. Every single fight scene and every single web slinging scene in the new Spider-Man movies are just so close to the action that at some points you don't really get a sense of the scope of the entire scene. You don't really get a sense of how much area that this covers. Whereas in the Sam Raimi movies, the wide shots that they used for Spider-Man web swinging and the very still camera that they often utilized when it was 2 combatants fighting really went a long way to selling not only the scale and the power that went behind these action scenes, but also not really confusing your audience. I'm not saying the action scenes in the Amazing Spider-Man movies are confusing per se, but there comes a time where I personally would like the camera pulled back. And this is probably the only area where I would be open to interpretation. Maybe you like having the camera closer to the action, but me personally, I like having it farther back. Well, obviously, no superhero origin story is complete without the story. Well, how do the origin stories handle? Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but in terms of the story, the Raimi movies are better. Both of them, both Spider-Man 1 and 2 are better from a storytelling perspective than the Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, because actually there's a lot of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that the Amazing Spider-Man, again, going back to trying to set up a large universe, the Amazing Spider-Man movies are trying to set up sequels. They are trying to set up spin-offs. They're trying to cram so many subplots into these movies that a lot of the time I didn't really feel like I was watching a self-contained story. Some of the time I felt like I was watching a commercial. When you have the evil Oscorp in the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, and you have the unresolved subplot of Peter Parker's parents and their ultimate fate in the first Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man movie, then I felt like, well, I hadn't actually seen a complete movie. I had seen deliberate sequel bait. Whereas in the first Spider-Man movie and in the second, they did a really good job of tying up all of the loose ends that have been hanging throughout the movie. Again, going back to the fundamental advantage that the older Spider-Man movies had is that they were self-contained. You could watch Spider-Man 1 and not be lost in any of the scenes. You could watch Spider-Man 2 and not be lost in any of the scenes because you might have missed something. No, Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 definitely tell more coherent stories. And the fact that they don't try to do too much like it seems like these newer Spider-Man movies are trying to do, what with trying to set up spin-offs and everything, they can really focus more on what an origin story should be, which is about the title character, which is about the people around him, which is about how and why he becomes a superhero. And in terms of actually getting into the superhero's psyche, I definitely felt that the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies accomplished that with far more ease than the Amazing Spider-Man. I'm sorry, but when I watch the Amazing Spider-Man, I feel like I'm watching not only a retread of plot points that we have seen before, but also of the filmmakers coming up to me and saying, "Yeah, get it. It'll be in the sequel. It'll be in the sequel. It'll be in the sequel." And a lot of the narrative decisions that they chose to make in these movies, I didn't really feel were appropriate to. I didn't really feel like they were appropriate to what is supposed to be a superhero origin story. I felt like several points, like the Richard and Mary Parker material, could have waited a few movies. A few things like Harry Osborn's eventual turn into the Green Goblin could have waited a few movies. The Rhino could have been saved for later. Really, when you're just starting out, it's generally a safe rule to have one primary villain per movie, maybe two. But 3, it becomes kind of a mess. And another thing about the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies is that they are a lot more tightly scripted than the new ones. Do you remember when he's hunting down his killer in? Do you remember when Peter Parker is hunting down Uncle Ben's killer in the Amazing Spider-Man? Yeah, they kind of forget about that. They completely drop that plot point when he needs to become Spider-Man. He becomes Spider-Man, and we never actually see if he got the guy. Now, maybe if they had done something like, well, sometimes you just don't get closure. Maybe if they had done something like that, I would be more forgiving. But it seems like the writers genuinely forgot about Uncle Ben's killer in the new one, whereas in the older one, not only do they devote the necessary time to catching the killer, but they also devote the necessary time to grieving over Uncle Ben. Again, someone who I just think was written off without much comment in the newer Spider-Man movies. There is appropriate time devoted to the loss of the major father figure in Peter Parker's life in the Tobey Maguire. And the fact that it is so well acted by Maguire and Rosemary Harris as Aunt May makes it all the more emotionally resonant. I feel like they sort of glossed over the Uncle Ben death scene in the new Amazing Spider-Man. And this goes back to the fundamental problem of doing another origin story, because on one hand you want to get the origin story out of the way, but on the other hand, why do you even need to do another origin story in the first place? At least at such great length. Now you might be thinking, well, how else are they going to get people acquainted with the character of Spider-Man? Well, A, the character of Spider-Man has become so ingrained in popular culture that I can scarcely think of anyone that I know who does not know his origin story. And also, think back to one of the early Marvel movies, The Incredible Hulk, the one with Edward Norton. They got across Hulk's origin story, his relationship with the characters of General Ross and Betty Ross, and why he is on the run. In the opening credits, there was this very well done montage where, again, they were following the classic rule of show, don't tell, where they got across Hulk's backstory, and you could really hit the ground running. You weren't lost as to why Bruce Banner was on the run in that movie. You weren't lost as to why he was at odds with General Ross. You you understood that yes, he has a romantic relationship with Betty, and obviously there are some things that you just can't show in montage, and you have to actually devote time to, like the romance. But again, Incredible Hulk did that. Incredible Hulk showed the strong feelings that he has for Betty Ross in the scenes between Edward Norton and Liv Tyler. So you'll forgive me if I think the Spider-Man origin story couldn't have gotten a similar treatment, especially since they both take place in a lab. I don't know if I polarized anyone by saying this, but for years I've liked watching the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. And again, this is going back to this video being my opinion. If you have a differing opinion, then that's fine. But in my personal experience, I just think as films, the old Spider-Man movies work a lot better as self-contained stories, as more intimate stories. You really get to know these characters. You remember every single character from the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Whereas the biggest problem with the newer Spider-Man movies is that they don't really seem to have their priorities straight. It seems like, well, on one hand, they want to tell the origin story. Well, on the other hand, they want to add this corporate espionage element. On the other hand, they want to establish 5 different villains at the same time. Well, on the other hand, they want to do something. They want to put a clever twist on the origin story. And on a completely separate note, they want to set up sequels. And on another note, they want to set up all of these Sinister Six spin-offs for the eventual Sinister Six movie and a possible Venom movie. It just seems like they're like money making. I hate to go in this direction, but it seems like money making is more of a motivating factor in the creation of these newer Spider-Man movies than it was in the old ones, right down to why they were created in the first place, which was because Sony was about to lose the rights to the Spider-Man films, and they had to crank out a Spider-Man movie as fast as possible. Faster than Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire were willing to make another one. So again, this goes back to the supposed artistic merit behind making a reboot. The Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies weren't getting overly stale, or at least not to the point of, say, Batman and Robin. There was nothing wrong with Spider-Man 3 that could not be fixed in the sequel, in a possible sequel. And in rebooting the franchise like this, it just seems you are trying to add a needless element of new energy to a series that's already had plenty of energy, it had plenty of money-making potential. And starting over like that, essentially wiping the slate clean instead of trying to improve on any mistakes that you made, seemed like a very cowardly move. And even as movies, and I'm not just saying this because I don't like the fact that they rebooted it so fast. I'm saying that as movies, the Sam Raimi versions of the Spider-Man story are better. They're more self-contained. There's more time devoted to the characters. The characters are more interesting. They are more memorable. And in my opinion, the effects and the action scenes are more appealing to look at. They're easier to follow while still being exhilarating, while still having that very high energy approach that Sam Raimi is known for. So if you like the new Spider-Man movies, then I can't really argue with you. I know I'm probably not going to change your mind, but all I can do is really give my personal perspective on the whole franchise. So, with that being said, of course I'm hoping that the third Amazing Spider-Man movie is going to be better. But thus far, I'm not really convinced that... I'm still not convinced that the series need to be rebooted, especially if the, again, in my opinion, inferior quality of the first 2 movies is any indication.
Shut up. Get out.